The Holt boys had run off 7 housekeepers in 14 months, and they were proud of it. Miles was 10, and Teddy was 8, and between them, they had developed a system that was, in its way, a work of terrible efficiency. The first housekeeper got a dead garter snake in her pillowcase. The second got pepper in her coffee. The third got the barn door unlatched at midnight, so the goats came into the kitchen. The fourth, fifth, and sixth received variations on the same theme: mud in the laundry, frogs in the bread box, the privy door nailed shut, until each one had packed her bag and marched to the depot and told Miles and Teddy's father that his sons were unmanageable and she would rather starve than spend another night under his roof. The 7th housekeeper lasted exactly 1 day. She arrived on the Monday coach, took one look at the boys standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch, with matching expressions of calculated hostility, and got back on the Tuesday coach without unpacking her trunk. Wyatt Holt did not blame the housekeepers. He blamed himself. He knew that his sons were not mean. They were angry. Angry at the consumption that had taken their mother 2 years ago. Angry at the God who had let it happen. Angry at the father who had not been able to stop it. And most of all, angry at any woman who walked into their house and stood where their mother had stood, and touched the stove their mother had touched, and slept in the bed their mother had died in. The housekeepers were not the problem. The grief was the problem. And Wyatt did not know how to fix grief, because he was drowning in his own. He placed the 8th advertisement on a Wednesday in March, in the Cheyenne paper, because the Cheyenne paper reached farther, and he had exhausted the patience of every woman within 100 miles of Iron Gate, Wyoming. Nell Ashby answered the advertisement because she had nothing else to answer. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and had spent the last 4 years as a cook at a lumber camp in the Bitterroots, which was the kind of job that teaches a woman 2 things: how to make food for men who do not notice what they are eating, and how to survive in conditions that would discourage a mule. Before the lumber camp, she had taught school in a mining town that closed, and before that she had worked on her uncle's ranch, and before that she had been a girl in Nebraska with a fishing pole and a creek, and a mother who said the most important thing a woman can do is pay attention. She arrived on the Thursday coach. She was tall and freckled, with red hair braided under a plain hat, and hands that were calloused from work, and a face that was not pretty in the way the frontier demanded, but interesting in the way that faces become interesting when they have been used for something. Eyes that noticed things, a mouth that smiled easily, a jaw that suggested she did not give up. Wyatt met her at the depot. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carrying too much weight for too long. He shook her hand and said, "I should warn you about the boys." "I read the advertisement," Nell said. "It mentioned that they are spirited. Spirited is a charitable word. They have chased off 7 women. They will try to chase you off too. What do they do? Snakes, frogs, nailed doors, pepper in the coffee. They are creative." "Good," Nell said. "Creative children are the best kind. They just need something better to be creative about." The ranch was 5 miles north of Iron Gate, at the base of a long timbered draw. The house was solid and well built. Wyatt was a carpenter before he was a rancher, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden and a barn that held 6 horses and a milk cow. The boys were waiting on the porch. Miles was tall for 10, dark-haired like his father, with sharp, watchful eyes and a mouth that was set in a line of preemptive defiance. Teddy was smaller, rounder, with lighter hair and a face that wanted to smile, but had forgotten how. Nell climbed down from the buckboard and walked to the porch, and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at both boys without smiling, because she had learned at the lumber camp that the worst thing you can do with hostile men, or hostile boys, is pretend they are not hostile. "My name is Nell Ashby," she said. "I know you do not want me here. I know you have chased off 7 women before me, and you are planning to chase me off too. I want you to know 2 things. First, I spent 4 years cooking for 40 lumberjacks who put far worse things in my coffee than pepper, and I am still standing. Second, I saw a creek about a mile back that looks like it has trout in it, and if either of you knows where I can find a fishing pole, I would rather do that than unpack." The boys stared at her. This was not in the script. The script called for the new housekeeper to bustle into the kitchen and start cleaning and tell them to wash their hands and call them dear or sweetheart and generally behave like a woman who was trying to be their mother, at which point they would execute phase 1 of the campaign: snake, frog, or goat, dealer's choice. Nobody in the script said anything about fishing. Miles looked at Teddy. Teddy looked at Miles. A communication passed between them that only brothers can read. "There are poles in the barn," Miles said, cautiously. "The creek runs behind the north pasture." "Show me," Nell said. They showed her. They walked her down through the pasture to the creek, which was running full with snowmelt and cold enough to numb your hands, and Miles found 3 poles and a tin of hooks in the barn, and they sat on the bank in the March sunshine, and Nell showed them how to tie a hook the way her mother had taught her, a clinch knot, tight and clean, and how to read the water for the dark pools where the trout hold. Teddy caught the first fish. It was a small brook trout, no bigger than his hand, bright with color, and when he pulled it out of the water, his face did the thing that Nell had been waiting for. It opened. The defiance fell off it like a mask coming loose, and underneath was a boy who was 8 years old and delighted, and who said, without thinking, "Look, Miss Ashby, look." "I see it," Nell said. "That is a fine fish." Miles caught the second. He did not smile, but his jaw unclenched, and he held the fish up, and looked at Nell with an expression that was not quite trust, but was the first cousin of it. The cautious interest of a child who has decided to stop fighting long enough to see what happens next. They fished for 2 hours. Nell caught nothing, which was deliberate, because the point was not the fish. The point was the 3 of them sitting on a creek bank in the sunshine, doing something that had nothing to do with housekeeping, or mothering, or replacing anyone. And by the time they walked back to the house with 4 small trout on a string, Nell had learned 2 things about the Holt boys that 7 housekeepers had missed. They were not angry at women. They were angry at loss, and the difference mattered. She cooked the trout for supper. She fried them in butter with salt and cornmeal, and served them on the good plates, and did not comment on the fact that the boys ate with their elbows on the table and their mouths open. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and watched his sons eat fish they had caught with a woman who had been in his house for 4 hours and had not once tried to clean anything, discipline anyone, or replace his wife. "Thank you," he said after supper, when the boys were outside throwing sticks for the dog. "For what?" "For not trying to be their mother." Nell dried her hands on the towel. They do not need a mother. They need an ally. Someone who is on their side without wanting anything from them. The housekeepers wanted to fix them. Nobody wants to be fixed. They want to be seen. Wyatt looked at her and something shifted in his face. The weight he had been carrying moved, not off his shoulders, but to one side, as if making room for something new. The next morning Nell woke to find a dead garter snake on her pillow. She picked it up, carried it to the kitchen, and was cooking breakfast when the boys came downstairs with faces carefully composed for the expected scream. There was no scream. There was bacon and eggs and coffee and a garter snake coiled peacefully in a jar on the windowsill. "I named him Herbert," Nell said. "He can live in the kitchen if you keep the jar clean." Teddy's mouth fell open. Miles's eyes narrowed. The script had been rewritten, and they did not know their lines. The campaign continued for another week. A frog in her boot, flour on the stairs, the milk bucket hidden in the hayloft, and Nell met each attack with the same unruffled calm, not ignoring the pranks but refusing to be defeated by them, treating each one as a creative achievement, to be acknowledged rather than a crime to be punished. When she found flour on the stairs, she said, "Good coverage. You missed a step on the left." When she found the milk bucket in the hayloft, she said, "That is actually a better place for it. The milk stays cooler up here." By the end of the second week, the pranks stopped. Not because the boys had run out of ideas, but because the game had lost its purpose. The purpose of the game was to make the housekeeper leave, and Nell was not leaving. And worse, or better, she was making it impossible to hate her because she was not acting like a housekeeper. She was acting like a person. She fished with them on Saturdays. She read to them at night. Adventure stories, not fairy tales, because she had asked them what they liked, and they had said they liked danger. She taught Miles to whittle and Teddy to braid a rope. She let them eat with their elbows on the table. On a rainy Saturday in late March, She found a trunk in the attic that the boys had not opened since their mother died. It held Helen's things: a shawl, a pair of gloves, a locket with a photograph inside, and a recipe book written in a careful hand with notes in the margins. Nell brought the trunk downstairs and set it on the kitchen table and opened it and let the boys decide what to do with it. Miles picked up the locket and held it for a long time, and then put it in his pocket without speaking. Teddy picked up the shawl and pressed it against his face, and breathed in, and his eyes filled. And Nell put her hand on his back, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. She took the recipe book, and opened it to a page that said apple cake in Helen's handwriting, and she said, "Would you like to make this?" They made it together, the three of them, following Helen's recipe step by step, Nell measuring, Teddy stirring, Miles cracking the eggs, and when the cake came out of the oven, it filled the house with a smell that had been missing for 2 years, and Teddy said, very quietly, "It smells like Mama." Wyatt came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway and smelled the cake, and his face went still, and then it broke, and he turned away and stood on the porch for a long time, with his hand over his eyes. Nell brought him a slice on a plate. She stood beside him on the porch and did not touch him and said, "The boys found Helen's recipe book. They wanted to make her cake." Wyatt ate the cake slowly. "She made this every Sunday," he said. "Then we will make it every Sunday too," Nell said. "Not to replace her, to remember her." He looked at her. In the afternoon light his face was raw and open, and grateful, and afraid, all at the same time, and he said, "How do you know what to do?" "I pay attention," Nell said. "My mother taught me that. It is the only thing I know how to do well. You do it better than anyone I have ever met." They stood on the porch together and ate Helen Holt's apple cake and watched the rain fall on the pasture. And somewhere inside the house, Teddy laughed. A real laugh, bright and sudden and full. And Miles said something sharp, and Teddy laughed again, and Wyatt closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him like warm water. One evening in April, Teddy fell asleep on the rug by the fire, and Nell picked him up and carried him to his bed, and when she laid him down, he reached up in his sleep and put his arms around her neck and held on, and she held still, and let him hold on until his grip loosened and he settled into the pillow, and she pulled the quilt up to his chin and went back to the main room and found Wyatt standing in the doorway. "He has not done that since Helen died," Wyatt said. His voice was thick. "He is not broken, Wyatt. He is just lonely. They both are." "So am I," Wyatt said, and then he looked at the floor as if he had said something he had not meant to say. Nell stood in the lamplight and looked at this man who had hired 7 women to fix his household, and had finally, accidentally, hired one who understood that the household did not need fixing. It needed fishing poles and garter snakes, named Herbert, and someone who would read adventure stories by the fire and carry a sleeping boy to his bed without waking him. "Wyatt," she said, "I did not come here to be your wife. I came here to be useful. But I want you to know that this is the first place I have been in a long time where I feel like I belong, and if that feeling is mutual, I would like to know it." He looked up. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was tight, and he said, "It is mutual. It has been mutual since the fishing poles." Miles appeared at the top of the stairs. He had been listening. He came down and stood between them, and looked up at his father, and then at Nell, and said, "Are you going to stay?" "If your father asks me to." "Pa," Miles said. "Ask her." Wyatt laughed. It was a broken, grateful, startled laugh, and he said, "Nell, will you stay?" "Yes," she said. "I will stay." They were married in June by the minister in Iron Gate. Miles stood beside his father and held the ring. Teddy stood beside Nell and held Herbert the garter snake in a jar, which the minister did not love, but allowed because, as he said later, it was the first time in 2 years he had seen those boys smile. Nell wore a blue calico dress, and Wyatt wore his good coat, and when the minister said the words, Teddy said, "Finally," and the whole church laughed, and the Holt family walked out into the summer sunshine. Not fixed, not replaced, not repaired, but found. Found by a woman with a fishing pole, and the patience to let 2 angry boys decide, on their own terms, that she was worth keeping.